After being engaged to the Lin family in the capital, I became the laughingstock of the entire capital city. This was only because I once disregarded my status as a daughter of the inner chambers and roamed the martial world as a chivalrous knight who robbed the rich to help the poor. How could an exposed woman be worthy of the noble Lin family in the capital? In the cold winter, my father ignored my persistent high fever and forced me to apologize publicly. Coincidentally, a young man dressed in fine clothes and riding a horse passed by and shielded me from the surging malice around me. He said, "Women do not have control over their lives and live with struggles, like caged birds or pond fish. However, this world is not just a man's world, it is also a woman's world." In the end, he looked at me gently, lowering his gaze. "Young lady, you are not wrong. The snow in the capital city should also stop falling." Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. At the palace night banquet, the guests were toasting each other. Only I knelt in the hall, humiliated under many watchful eyes by Empress Su. She joked with the concubines beside her, her eyes seemingly inadvertently glancing at me. "I heard you used to be a chivalrous knight in the martial world, your swordsmanship must be outstanding. How about this, let the young lady perform a dance for His Majesty and all the sisters in the palace." Empress Su bit off the words chivalrous knight quickly and lightly, yet it stirred up a burst of laughter at the banquet. Daughters of the inner chambers in the capital city had never stepped out of their houses from birth to death. Being a chivalrous knight in the martial world was undoubtedly rebellious. Empress Su was mocking me. I raised my eyes, clarity in my gaze. "Your Highness, Ling Shui cannot dance." Empress Su was taken aback, and immediately a palace concubine picked up a wine cup and threw it at my head. "Lady Zhao, how dare you defy Her Highness? Where do you place His Majesty's dignity? Where do you place Her Highness's dignity?" With these words, everyone fell silent. They all looked towards Lin Che, whose expression remained unreadable on the high steps. Only Empress Su murmured coquettishly, "Your Majesty, look, this woman who has roamed the martial world does not know etiquette." Lin Che said nothing. But he met my gaze. A sharp pain spread across my forehead. And I held my head high, allowing droplets of blood to drip down one by one, hitting the cold stone floor. After a long time, his impassive face inexplicably carried a peculiar smile. He said, "Ling Shui, the Empress is still the Empress." His partiality was so apparent. Upon hearing this, Empress Su beamed and immediately wanted to send someone over to seize me. I lifted my skirt, revealing the hideously scarred marks at my ankle, then stretched out my hands, with scars like centipedes similar to those on my ankles. This was the reason I could not dance. The current emperor and empress had grown up together, with a deep childhood bond. But my father unreasonably placed me between the two of them. He set up a marriage contract with the Lin family in the capital to bring me back from the martial world, and wanted me to settle down and marry. But who was the Lin family in the capital? Such a noble family could easily marry a princess. How could a little girl from a decent family be enough? Thus, rumors spread throughout the capital city. They said the martial world was dangerous and chaotic. A young woman like me could not keep her purity and had probably long since lost it, having been with countless people. My father thought I brought him shame and wished I would take a sword to end my life. In the cold winter, my brother ignored my high fever and forced me to apologize publicly. And so, I became the sacrifice of this marriage contract. The tendons in my hands and feet were severed by villains, destroying all my martial arts. I became the laughingstock of everyone in the capital city. Empress Su's mood visibly improved. Pretending to be surprised, she was about to cover her mouth and fall into Lin Che's arms when she overheard some court ladies whispering below. If this is true, how did Lady Zhao enter the palace? I heard Lady Zhao was snatched back by His Majesty from the street. At that time Lady Zhao had already signed a marriage contract with the young General Gu from the north of the city, which is now improper and illegitimate. Before the words were finished, before Empress Su could get angry, Lin Che beside her frowned slightly, his face showing faint anger, and he spoke softly again. "How dare you?" The two court ladies immediately knelt and apologized. The atmosphere in the hall was tense as a string, only Empress Su smiled slightly. "Your Majesty, she is just a newly admitted sister, let's not get angry, besides, That kind of filthy little soldier has long since died." Her words fell, and Lin Che suddenly turned his head, glaring at her. That look was extremely terrifying, scaring Empress Su into a pale face. Lin Che turned his head again to look at me. He hid once more in the darkness of the night, making his expression unreadable. After a long time, I finally heard him sneer. "Young General Gu is still at least a young general, and you are but a rebellious woman. You do not deserve him." Young General Gu Ziyan. His family background was not considered noble, and his home in the north of the city was rather shabby. His cooking skills were not great, the fish soup he stewed had a burnt taste. And his handwriting was terrible, crooked like earthworms in the spring mud. But he once rescued me from fire and water when I was criticized by others and spoke up for me. He said, "Women do not have control over their lives and live with struggles, like caged birds or pond fish. However, this world is not just a man's world, it is also a woman's world. Young lady, you are not wrong. The snow in the capital city should also stop falling." Gu Ziyan was open-hearted, never disguising his sincerity. Later, after my tendons in my hands and feet were severed, the Lin family rejected and annulled our engagement. While I was confined to a small corner of the Zhao family estate, he was sent off to war on the frontier. On his way past the Zhao family house, he entrusted someone to deliver a talisman for safety to me. At that time, I was anxious, fearing once again that I'd be seen as out of line and improper. In my haste to tell someone to discard the talisman, I inexplicably opened it. Inside was a piece of paper with 4 words. "The pure remain pure." Because of these words, I gathered my strength again. Even if my tendons were completely severed, I refused to languish in weakness and become a pitiful figure for everyone to scorn, lying all day in my bed. Since I couldn't engage in martial arts, I turned to studying literature. The Zhao family boasts a scholarly lineage, and learning the literary arts comes much easier than practicing martial skills. I heard that a piece of my artwork found its way among the people and some were willing to pay a great price for it. Upon discovering that I was the artist behind the piece, many sighed with admiration. Yet, alongside the admiration came rampant rumors. With Lin Che's engagement still unsettled, my reappearance in society seemed to cause a stir. Accusations flew that I was seeking attention for ulterior reasons. The world's animosity towards women never seems to end. My father angrily accused me of being born only to cause trouble and seduce. As a punishment, he made me kneel in the snow for 3 days and 3 nights. During this time, I developed a high fever, yet the nanny couldn't find a doctor to see me. I was suddenly aware that my father wanted me to die. Exhausted, lying sick in bed, I barely held on until finally, a doctor arrived. 1 bowl of medicine later, I fell into a deep sleep. When I awoke, I couldn't distinguish day from night, all I saw was inky darkness. It happened that Gu Ziyan returned triumphant. And I heard the commotion was overwhelming, with firecrackers echoing along the 10-mile-long street. I asked the nanny, "Why is it that though we are all human, men can do things that women cannot?" The nanny stayed silent. No one delved into why those villains severed my tendons. And no one questioned why a single bowl of medicine rendered me blind. Justice for me was trivial indeed. I found a piece of white silk, intending to hang myself in my room at midnight. However, just as the silk touched my neck, the sound of a blade slicing through the air brushed past my ear. The silk snapped, and I collapsed to the floor, unsupported. Someone stood before me. 3 steps away, in their right hand was a long sword, and they had a slender build. Moments ago, they used a short blade to sever the silk. The short blade lay an arm's length away, near my left hand. Having roamed the edges of the world for years, I quickly gathered what I needed to protect myself. Before my would-be rescuer could act, I slowly reached out and grasped the short blade, swiftly striking out. To succeed, one must be quick, precise, and relentless in a single move. However, the stranger moved faster. The long sword seemed to carry a gust of wind as it narrowly skimmed my hair. The short blade was knocked from my grasp instantly, clattering to the floor. "Miss Zhao, are you well?" The unfamiliar yet familiar voice poured into my ears, and I halted in my steps, scarcely believing what I heard. "Is that you, General Gu?" When I received Lin Che's mocking words, Empress Su was the happiest. The Su family was renowned for military prowess, with 3 generations falling in battle, dying to protect the emperor's safety. She is the only daughter of her generation, wielding profound influence. Enough to enter the palace as a consort, surpassing the former influence of Lin's family in the capital. Simply put, Lin Che was not fit for her. As a result, his marriage plans continued to be delayed. Later, turmoil gripped the country, and Lin Che was transformed from a minor marquis to the present emperor, thanks in no small part to the Su family. After a night banquet, as I walked along the palace path in silence, I unexpectedly crossed paths with Empress Su's sedan chair. My residence was remote and secluded, and running into her was a genuine surprise. But I dared not think much about it. With other palace women, I knelt low on the ground. The sedan chair stopped firmly before me, and a pair of exquisitely embroidered shoes appeared in front of my eyes, the pearls on them looking round and lovely. "Lady Zhao, do you think you are worthy of young General Gu?" I looked up at her. She motioned for the palace attendants to retreat 3 steps and softly said, "This way, no one will know." This matter was the talk of everyone back then, and naturally, I too want to know. She was speaking of my rumored betrothal to Gu Ziyan. Indeed, it caused quite a stir back then. But at its root, the one meant to marry Gu Ziyan was just an orphan girl he found by the river. Nameless, unsure of where her family is. Disabled with 2 bad legs, and blind in both eyes. It wasn't me, the one set to marry Gu Ziyan wasn't me. The Zhao Lingshui from the Zhao estate had long been drowned at the pond's edge. I remained silent for a long time, but Empress Su's next words made me straighten my back. She asked, "Do you know how young General Gu died?" How would I know? All I knew was when the border crisis arose, I was taken to the palace by Lin Che. And as everyone praised my fortune, Gu Ziyan volunteered for the expedition. He died on the road, and his body was never found. Yet I couldn't believe it, his martial skills were exceptional, his swordsmanship unparalleled. Who would dare kill him within our territory, clad in armor? Empress Su looked down from above, a delicate smile on her cheeks, as she pronounced her words clearly, watching me. That day was a rainy day, the mountain paths were slippery, and the horse had been drugged. He fell at the edge of the cliff. If he had jumped and died, it would have been easy, but he was a general, with his own pride. So they trapped young General Gu, making him watch as his trusted men were hanged. Then broke his legs, scarred his face, and pierced his eyes with arrows. My heart suddenly throbbed with pain, as if a bone inside had broken. I knew there were no bones in the heart, yet the pain was relentless. I heard my own hoarse voice, "Who did this cruel deed?" Empress Su returned to her carriage, tilting her head to look at me. "You should know, some people you can't touch. Once you do, you bring disaster upon yourself. This misfortune may not fall on you, but on those around you." The meaning in her words was painfully clear. Gu Ziyan died because of me. The string taut in my mind for years snapped instantly. I lost control and threw myself at Empress Su's feet, prostrating as I desperately pleaded with her. Was it His Majesty? Did His Majesty order this? "Lady Zhao." Empress Su's expression turned stern as she loudly rebuked. "Who permitted you to speak such slander against His Majesty?" I stared blankly at her. Even if Empress Su did not intentionally tell me, how could I not know that the one who killed Gu Ziyan back then was Lin Che? All along, I had been deceiving myself. I trembled as I stood up. The murderer who killed Gu Ziyan climbed to his current position over the blood of many people. The little marquis of the Lin family in the capital city. He schemed for power, using the influence of the Su family to soar to the top. He calculated every move, willing to do anything to satisfy his desires, including killing innocent people. Lin Che did not expect me to come. He seemed a bit surprised, but that surprise quickly faded. The hall was brightly lit, the flame flickering with the breeze, casting shadows on his face that highlighted and dimmed it alternately. He was the only bloodline of the Lin family, thus every request was fulfilled. Even if the imperial palace was brightly lit, it couldn't compare to the house of the marquis with its luminous pearls. As emperor, he might still be somewhat frugal. I knelt silently. When the candles burned out, he lifted his eyes slightly, a mocking smile in his gaze. Is it for what I just said in the hall? Have you come to seek a reason? I shook my head. He propped his head, as if recalling something. You loved painting when you were a girl. Someday I'll find a master painter to spar with you. I remained silent. Seeing I didn't respond, he seemed a bit embarrassed, and then said, If you wish to practice martial arts, it's rather tricky. Your meridians have been severed for years, you might need to find a reclusive master. I looked up at him. Over these years, how well did he know me, and how much did he secretly investigate me? I did not know. But what I sought was never these things. Your Majesty, do you know I later went blind and was drowned in the lotus pond? Lin Che tilted his head slightly to look at me, but his emotions were well hidden. After a while, he said, I know. I laughed. Then, Your Majesty, do you know who saved me? Lin Che replied, I know. I asked again. Your Majesty knows I lost all my martial arts. Knows I was once blind, knows I survived near-death experiences. Then do you know who the instigator behind all these was? Lin Che unconsciously rubbed his thumb ring and said nothing for a long time. I lowered my gaze, hiding the tears gathering in my eyes. Back then, I heard him say darkly, it's been many years, the killer is hard to determine. Is it really? I wanted to laugh, but my nose felt sour, tears welled up in my eyes. Is it truly so? No matter how the Zhao family didn't love me, no matter how much they despised me, I always remained a Zhao. I became crippled without reason. To them, it was undoubtedly losing a significant chess piece. Your Majesty. My words did not clarify, but as I uttered those two words, he suddenly got enraged and overturned the table. The brushes, inks, paper, and inkstones crashed to the ground with a loud noise. I was reminded of the past. After all, in my life, only the past was left to me. Back then, Lin Che did not want to marry me, but it was an engagement set by the old marquis. Officially, he had to comply. But secretly he had ways to deal with a young lady from a reputable family left with just a good name. The thugs were his arrangement. So even if the Zhao family tried to investigate back then, they only dared to probe halfway because on the other end of the clues was the Lin family in the capital city. The first time, it was him. The second time, it was still him. The third time, naturally, was him. All my suffering was because of him. Your Majesty, I am the wife of young General Gu, with heaven and earth as witness. The sun and moon as matchmakers, and a marriage certificate as proof. I straightened my back, pulling out a safety amulet from my bosom. Years had passed, the silk embroidery on it had faded, and that marriage certificate was hidden inside. Your Majesty, it bears the official seal. Lin Che's face grew more and more somber, like a mountain on the verge of collapsing. I attempted to say more, but he leaned down, grabbed my neck, and shouted, Zhao Lingshui, how dare you speak again? Even though I struggled to breathe, I still had to speak. Since there is an official seal, according to the laws of our dynasty, it counts even if we have not performed the marriage rites. Before I could finish, Lin Che's eyes widened with rage. He snatched the marriage certificate from my hand and tore it to shreds with astonishing speed. The room filled with paper confetti, landing on the candle flames. Tears began to fall from my eyes. I beg your Majesty to release me from the palace. I have survived this long only because the mourning period for General Gu has not yet ended. I am grateful for the Emperor's care and provision for the officials' families over the years. Now that the mourning period has ended, I wish to return home. Home. To the north side of town, to my Gu family, where my dear General Gu is waiting for me. Lin Che would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, yet as an emperor, he was diligent and conscientious. Everyone praised him as a rare emperor in 100 years. Between him and me, there was a deep-seated enmity of blood, but I could not seek revenge. Gu Ziyan said his greatest wish was to see peace throughout the land. For the people to live in stability, his life's ambition. All I want is to go home. I kept bowing until I realized the ground was stained with blood. The night wind howled as Lin Che trembled and stepped back, his eyes reddened with unknown feelings. In a low voice, he asked, Lingshui, isn't this your home? Upon leaving the palace, I realized just how cold the night wind was. The bright moon hung high, and the lamps on the road made it as bright as day, as if stars from the sky had been brought down. Yet none of this belonged to me. The man I was to marry was General Gu from the north side of town. He was so poor he could barely afford to light 2 candles at night. Gu Ziyan would joke, saying when I married him, we could light 5. All these years, he had been saving up. Marrying a wife meant she should live comfortably. When I married him, life would surely be good. I laughed at his honeyed words. Yet in countless nightmares, I could always dream of him rescuing me from the riverbank, taking care of me day and night, dream of him climbing high mountains searching for a healer for my eyes, dream of his clumsy attempts to choose my wedding dress. Since our parents were gone, he said the sun and moon would witness our vows. He wanted everyone in Capital City to know he was taking a wife. So he rode a horse, hired a dozen people, and with horns blaring and a flower palanquin, he took me from the north side of the city to the east side, and back from the east side to the north. I wholeheartedly wanted to marry him. That day, the wind was strong, lifting the ribbons on the flower palanquin. As I anxiously adjusted my veil, I saw through a small gap my father and brother. Through that small gap, they saw me as well. They seemed amazed that my eyesight had returned and were shocked I was still alive. Stunned for a moment, they unthinkingly blocked the flower palanquin. By that time, Lin Che had seized power and risen to a high position. My brother, in an attempt to gain favor, presented me to him like a treasure. Your Majesty, this is my sister who was once betrothed to you. Do you remember? I knelt quietly on the ground. Until he softly asked me to raise my head, I dared to glance up briefly before lowering my gaze again quickly. It was the first time I met Lin Che. He wore casual dress, adorned with a jade crown, appearing gentle. Before he became emperor, he was a child of extraordinary beauty and, though not graced with unmatched looks as an adult, he was still the romantic interest of many noble ladies in Capital City. And I wore the wedding dress chosen by Gu Ziyan, the hairpin selected by Gu Ziyan, even the pearl earrings crafted by Gu Ziyan's own hands. The bridal palanquin waited outside for me. I did not understand what Lin Che wanted. His prolonged silence ended when he finally asked, "What is your name?" Still kneeling, I replied, "Your servant is named Zhao Lingshui." And that was the beginning of my story with Lin Che. Later, not too long after, I was taken to the imperial palace, placed in an insignificant corner, becoming nothing more than the topic of idle chatter for the nobles within. At first, I would ask Lin Che, "What about General Gu?" But no one answered me, no one spoke to me, and eventually, Gu Ziyan died. I dream every day. Sometimes, in the dream, Gu Ziyan takes me to the outskirts of the city to distribute relief, spending a large sum of silver to trade for a few bags of rice. The porridge I cook is like water, and Gu Ziyan teases me for overcooking the rice. His teasing always leaves me exasperated, making me want to hit him with a stick. Only then did I realize why he was so impoverished. Though General Gu wielded swords and slayed many on the battlefield, he had a contrasting side. He was a devout believer. On the 1st and 15th of every month, he would go to the temple to burn incense and pray. I suddenly remembered. When I lost my sight, my family went to the temple to worship. I had sneaked to the back of the mountain. I clearly remember, in the back of the mountain, there was a crooked neck tree. I always carried a white silk with me. The last time I'd failed at home, I would succeed by changing locations. Trembling, I tied the silk to the crooked neck tree. But as soon as I approached the silk, it was shattered by something sharp, and I fell, flailing in all directions. In the valley, there was always the sound of the wind. By relying on the sound, I couldn't discern if anyone was there. Suspicion filled my mind as if haunted by a ghost. And I absent-mindedly pulled out a second strip of white silk from my pocket. Over and over, I found myself sprawled on the ground. Who's there? Frustrated and furious, I groped around the back mountain until my family found me, bruised and battered. Is it you? Coming to my senses, I placed my hands on my hips and angrily scolded Gu Ziyan. Without waiting for his answer, I gritted my teeth and declared, "It must be you." Gu Ziyan burst into silent laughter. In the middle of the night, I started to burn with fever. The maidservant attending to me didn't dare call an imperial doctor, only wiping my sweat time and again. Familiar footsteps approached, and the bed curtain was gently lifted. Groggily, thinking I was still dreaming, I murmured, "Gu Ziyan, you're bold. We haven't even been married yet. What are you doing in my room?" Silence surrounded me, even the wind seemed to have weakened. When my consciousness cleared a bit, I barely opened my eyes and saw several imperial doctors kneeling before my bed, and Lin Che's hand hovering near my forehead. Just a finger's width away. I screamed instinctively and backed into a corner, trembling under the covers. "I am General Gu's fiancé. He said he would take me to the northwest to watch the moon, never to stay in the capital city. I can't become a roaming hero, but he said he would help me fulfill that dream." "Ling Shui, do you really wish to see Gu Ziyan?" Lin Che asked softly. I looked at him in a daze, dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept. I nodded heavily. Hearing this, he reached out his hands towards me. Just as his fingers were about to touch mine, a horrific vision flashed through my mind. Blood splattering everywhere, Gu Ziyan being held down by countless people, slicing his body with knives, blinding him, preventing him from calling for help, and forcing him to crawl in humiliation. And the mastermind behind all of this was Lin Che, right before me. Ah! Terrified, I pushed him away. Caught off guard, he fell to the ground, and the surrounding palace attendants hurriedly surrounded him. Lin Che grasped the curtain with trembling hands, his lips moved silently. He looked at me, speechless. I curled up in my blanket, shivering, muttering quietly, "General Gu, save me. General Gu, please come and take me home." The palace people called me crazy, saying I dared push Lin Che. But Empress Su claimed that General Gu's mourning period was approaching its end, and he died uneasily, intending to take someone he cared about with him before it ended. So, she requested a shaman to exorcise the palace. The whole affair was handled beautifully, receiving praise for her generosity. When Lin Che heard about this after early court, he openly berated Empress Su and punished her by making her kneel in the Buddha hall. She had been pampered since childhood, never enduring such an affront, immediately questioning him. "Your Majesty, do you truly fancy that Zhao Lingshui? Even though she was someone else's wife, and now she's gone mad, you still want to take someone else's wife for yourself?" It was said that Lin Che's face changed dramatically, and in a fit of rage, he slapped her across the face in public. That slap almost completely shattered the camaraderie of their youth. When the maidservant told me, I was still lying in bed in a daze. After a long time, I asked, "Nanny, do you think I can leave the palace?" A trace of reluctance crossed the maidservant's face, but she still told me, "Yes, young lady, our young lady will surely leave the palace." The maidservant had grown up with me. In the past, when my mother didn't care for me, the maidservant protected me, made cloaks for me, braided my hair. I was silent for a while, then asked, "But Nanny, what did I do wrong? If I were not at fault, why would I suffer torment and injustice?" The maidservant held me in her arms, continuously comforting. If General Gu were still here, he would come and take the young lady home. My nose tingled, and tears welled up uncontrollably. The Emperor and Empress had been at odds for several days, and it was rumored that even the usually reticent General Su couldn't help but speak up to advise them. Apparently, Empress Su was still young and often careless. Bringing in the shaman only confirmed the gossip about Lin Che coveting someone else's wife. Turning the conversation, it was said he acted inappropriately, punishing the Empress publicly. His words mixed criticism and advice, both subtle and direct. It enraged Lin Che, who lost his temper in the sleeping quarters, yet he had to relent eventually. Each night, I slept uneasily, hearing noises in the middle of the night. Large hands anxiously groped my body, startling me awake. And in the moonlight, I saw the person's face clearly. It was Lin Che. Reeking of alcohol, his face flushed, he tried to pull open my skirt, bringing his lips to my neck. I was still ill, and the difference in strength between men and women was wide. I couldn't break free. Despairingly, I widened my eyes. I saw the maidservant standing dazed by the door, an iron basin clattering from her hands. Quickly stepping to the bedside, pleading loudly, "Your Majesty, This is the wife of young General Gu, she's signed the marriage papers. And with the 3 letters and 6 ceremonies, she's to be married into the Gu family. Now, young General Gu's mourning period is not yet over. His Majesty doing this is truly, truly inappropriate. At the last sentence, Lin Che, who was lying on top of me, suddenly froze. He incredulously propped himself up to look at me and repeatedly looked back at the nanny on the floor. It seemed as if his mind was finally clearing up. Lin Che, after all, still had some principles. Bringing me into the palace could be explained as protecting an official's family. But if there was any real development, it would be considered scandalous. His face turned pale bit by bit, holding onto the curtains without speaking. He hesitated for a moment before turning to leave, but then there was a loud thud. Outside the door, there were exclamations from the palace servants. His Majesty, quickly call the imperial physician. Confused, I hid under the covers, and it was the nanny who held me in her arms. Don't be afraid, lady. You'll soon be able to leave the palace. Lin Che fell ill. He was so ill that he missed the morning court for 3 consecutive days. For several years since he ascended the throne, he had been diligently attending. Never had anything like this happened. All the ministers in court were inquiring about the situation in the palace. And Empress Su issued a strict order that if anyone leaked the news of that night, they would be killed without mercy. At the same time, she summoned me and mocked me. I thought that by telling you how young General Gu died, you would have some resentment towards His Majesty. Little did I know you were shamelessly seducing His Majesty. If young General Gu has a spirit in heaven, he couldn't bear to see you, this harlot, enter his ancestral tomb. I silently knelt down. She seemed still unsatisfied, disregarding decorum, rushed down from the high platform, grabbed my chin, and slapped me twice, hard. My cheeks instantly swelled up. When Empress Su was about to slap again, a palace servant beside her stopped her. Your Majesty, it won't look good if you keep hitting. She glared at me fiercely, her face full of disdain. Disgraceful woman. When I came out of the palace hall, the nanny came up to me. Her heart aching as she looked at my face, tears welling in her eyes, hesitating to speak all the way. She was an old nanny who couldn't hide her words, like my grandmother. I coaxed her in a low voice, and she finally opened her mouth. Miss, young General Gu is not dead. Tonight, just tonight, he will come to take us out of the palace. General Gu is not dead. Gu Ziyan is not dead. These words kept echoing in my mind. I almost couldn't believe or dare to think about it. After a long pause, I stammered again, Nanny, is this true? The nanny nodded earnestly. Miss, this is truer than gold. I asked the nanny many things about Gu Ziyan, asking until nightfall. When the nanny finally had time to talk to me about leaving the palace. Every day at midnight, the water carts transporting inside the palace would change shifts. We needed to hide in there until dawn to follow the carts out of the palace. The nanny said Gu Ziyan would meet us outside. As long as we got out, we could see him. Before getting into the water cart, I was a little uneasy. Nanny, you'll leave the palace with me, right? The nanny lovingly touched my hair. My silly girl, look, there's another water cart not far away. I strained to look into the distance and indeed saw a water cart, and only then did I relax. The space inside the water cart was vast, yet I huddled in a corner, not daring to let my guard down for a moment. Until late at night, I inexplicably fell into a dream again. I saw Gu Ziyan. Ever since my veins were severed, my whole body ached on rainy days. That day was the 15th, he was going up the mountain to pray, and I insisted on going too. He couldn't refuse me, so he coaxed. Fine, my darling Miss Zhao, hurry on up onto my back. I'm willing to be your little horse. I teased him, saying he spoke disgustingly. But I still allowed him to carry me on his back broad and warm. And on the back of his neck was a conspicuous red mole. I couldn't help but lean on his shoulder, my hands restlessly touching the mole, laughing softly. Oh my General Gu, besides the mole here, is there one on your waist? He laughed too, his earlobes turning red. I bent to look at him, but his face inexplicably turned into Lin Che's. I quivered all over, waking up in a cold sweat. The water cart's lid was lifted. and there were countless people surrounding it, with Lin Che standing in the middle. A flash of lightning revealed the young emperor's features, white as a ghost. I screamed in fear, continually calling out, "Gu Ziyan, save me. Nanny, save me." But no matter how I called, no one responded. I was shut back in the bedchamber by Lin Che. He looked at me for a long time. And it wasn't until he was about to leave that I finally couldn't help but run over and ask him, "Your Majesty, where is my nanny?" He didn't speak, and I clung to him, begging on the floor, "Your Majesty, please return my nanny to me. It was I who begged her to take me out of the palace, it's not her fault. Please don't kill her, I beg you." Lin Che looked down at me, saying each word clearly. "You, I can spare, but that nanny must die." Heartbroken and shattered. Pain overwhelmed me, making it hard to breathe. I pounded my chest, asking him repeatedly, how could I keep the nanny with me? Perhaps he pitied me, or perhaps he had another way to execute the punishment. Under my pleading, he finally asked, "Ling Shui, isn't this your home?" The same question as that night. That night, I answered him, saying, "This is His Majesty's palace, His Majesty's home, the home of His Majesty's concubines. How could it be the home of a mourning officer's widow?" But today, I cried my heart out. Kneeling at his feet, I told him, it is the home of this servant, and this servant will stay here forever, never leaving." This was my promise to Lin Che. But he still refused to let the nanny go. And I finally realized, Gu Ziyan hadn't come back to life, it was all a beautiful dream the nanny fabricated for me. Even the distant water wheel was fake. From the beginning, the nanny only found a way to get me out of the palace. I sat alone on the bed, outside a storm raged with thunderbolts causing uneasiness. I got up and opened the dressing case, where I had hidden a vial of poison in the dark. Gu Ziyan was a soldier, if something happened to him, I was bound to accompany him. For many years, because of the nanny, I hadn't been able to use it. I hid the poison in my sleeve and watched the storm through the window all night. Until dawn, messages started arriving from the emperor and empress. They argued again. This time, the conflict was more intense than usual. Lin Che slapped Empress Su twice in public and even threatened to depose her immediately. I didn't know what they quarreled about, only hearing that today's court session was filled with uproar. General Su's faction demanded the killing of the demon girl. And the officials submitted petitions, threatening to resign if she wasn't killed. Lin Che, enraged, broke the handle of the dragon throne, exclaiming, "Rebellion! It's all rebellion!" Many in the palace were also informants for General Su. When the angry crowd arrived at my palace gate, I was somewhat astonished. So, I was the demon girl who enchanted the sovereign. I chuckled wryly. The situation had spiraled beyond control, and I was dragged to Lin Che's sleeping quarters by palace servants. "Your Majesty, this girl has enchanted your heart and cannot be left alive. Your Majesty, the Empress is the mistress of the harem. If not for this girl, Your Majesty and Her Majesty would have been as inseparable as fish and water. How did it come to this? Kill her! Kill her!" Cries rose and fell. I remained quietly kneeling on the ground. The world is always like this. Being a gallant swordswoman is wrong for a woman. A king fascinated by worldly pleasures is still blamed on a woman. They always have reasons to blame women for everything. Just then, the palace doors creaked open. In came Lin Che. "I will give everyone an explanation. But I wish to speak with Mrs. Gu for a moment." He referred to me as Mrs. Gu, not by my surname Zhao or name Ling Shui. Last night's pouring rain was followed by a bright, sunny day. I squinted, looking up at him. His accompanying servants came to escort me in. It was my first time stepping into Lin Che's sleeping palace, which was cold and sparse. Unbefitting a young emperor. He invited me for tea, and I realized his attire today was somewhat like the first time I met him. Dressed in regular clothes with a jade crown. He didn't look well, but he forced a smile at me. I lowered my eyes, avoiding his gaze. "You must have thought our first meeting was at the Zhao family." He got up naturally, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a vermilion box. Just as no one knows about my fondness for painting. I was stunned, inexplicable threads in my mind connected. On the day I married Gu Ziyan, the first person who saw me wasn't my father or brother, it was Lin Che. That day, a storm swept through as he peered through the wind at his former fiancée. Bright eyes and white teeth, slender willow eyebrows, with shallow dimples in her cheeks. The surprise of that day was comparable to acquiring a greatly treasured painting in the marketplace. He cherished it dearly but was told by the Su family she was the one who shamelessly insisted on marrying him. Zhao Lingshui. A daughter of the rivers and lakes, vulgar and crude. He thought it was just another ploy to marry him, so he tossed the painting into the snow in rage. The snow melted, blurring and ruining the painting. But he couldn't bear to let it go. He retrieved it, placing it in the box. Never opening it again until that brief moment he was struck by her beauty in the wind, prompting him to open the painting once more. Just like today. Lin Che gently caressed the painting that had long turned yellow. The plum blossoms on it were no longer recognizable. In my youth, I was somewhat arrogant. If I had accepted the Zhao family's proposal, would everything have been different? He looked at me. He looked at me for a long, long time, from my eyes to my lips, his hand holding the painting subtly trembling. I thought I had trained a group of loyalists, but in the end, this group is still General Su's people. I knew what he wanted to say. Having lost the internal struggle against General Su. To stabilize his throne, he had to push someone out to die. And that person, that cause, is me, and can only be me. I quietly met his gaze, only asking, "Is the nanny still alive?" Lin Che nodded. That was enough, all this was enough. Exchanging my life for the nanny's, there was nothing wrong with that. As I was being sent out of the chamber, he suddenly called out to me. His voice was low and hoarse, but I still heard it. Lin Che was crying, shouting, "Ling Shui, I'm sorry. But I did not want to forgive him." When brought to the Grand Hall, civil and military officials instantly surrounded me. All speaking at once, they discussed how to decide my death. I continued to kneel silently on the ground. From youth until now, I dared not, nor did I want to argue much for myself. When Lin Che ascended to the high seat, those old ministers finally began to offer advice. Various bizarre executions, truly horrifying. Lin Che rested his head on his hand, half his face hidden in darkness. "Since all of you say she is a witch, why not send her to the brothel to be a prostitute, is that agreeable?" As soon as he said this, the entire court paused, then suddenly shouted in unison, "Long live your majesty." The lowest prostitute in this world, to be carried by the lowest corpse carrier in this world, all the way to the brothel. Despised by thousands, cursed by tens of thousands. Without a moment's hesitation, I drank the silence potion handed to me by the palace servants in one gulp. At once, my throat was filled with an indescribable roughness, as if pierced by thousands of needles. Lin Che turned his back, seemingly unable to bear watching any longer. I quietly stood up, only to see at the bright doorway, a hunched figure appeared. The visitor was limping, hunched over, their face long destroyed. Eyes tightly shut, showing countless scars down to the white bone. With just one glance, I lost all senses. A tremendous sourness welled within me, mixed with a hint of sweetness. He carried me. Step by step, out of the grand hall. I didn't know how he, blind, could distinguish directions. Nor did I know how he had survived. Is he doing well? Is anyone bullying him? The sweetness in my throat rose up, blood oozed from my lips, the pain in my abdomen growing increasingly palpable. I wondered if this was a hallucination before death. The palace path was long, I couldn't hear anyone else speak. Nor could I see anyone else, my gaze fixed solely on him. On his neck, there was a red mole. With big gulps, I spat out, yet never before felt as at peace as I did now. Like back then, I gently leaned on his shoulder, listening to his heartbeat. What was I thinking at that time? I was thinking. At the spring banquet, green wine, a cup and a song. I bowed and made 3 wishes. May my lord live 1,000 years, may my body remain healthy. May we, like swallows on the beam, see each other year after year.